In this video, I'm going to go over the history of softball and why it's a different game than baseball. Stick with me and let's find out the answer together. What's going on, everybody? Thanks for joining me back on my channel, Brutus on Baseball. Major League Baseball has recently teamed up with Athletes Unlimited Softball League, or the AUSL. Much like the NBA invested in the WNBA in 1996. But whereas the WNBA has thrived, softball has struggled to establish a professional league. So this partnership is a big step for the sport and its athletes, and hopefully the start of something that could explode in the future, much like the WNBA has. But the big difference between these two comparisons is that the WNBA and the NBA games are very similar to one another, whereas softball and baseball have a lot of similarities, but at the same time, there are huge differences as well. The most obvious differences are readily apparent to fans of either sport, like the size of the ball, the underhand pitching motion, the base stealing is different, and the dimensions of the field itself. Both the diamond and the distance to the bases, as well as the outfield fences, are all different between softball and baseball. These distinct differences actually make the way the game is played very different from one another. My daughter has been playing softball for 2 seasons now, and I've been forced to learn quickly how different it is from baseball, but it really got me wondering, why is softball different from baseball? What is the history of the game that led to the bigger ball and underhand pitching? For most baseball fans, we know that there was a women's league of professional baseball during the war years in the early 1940s, a story famously told in the movie A League of Their Own. But when did women's baseball morph into softball and why? Or did it happen that way? That's the story I'm going to share with you in this video. This may come as a huge surprise to a lot of viewers out there, as it did for me as well when researching this, but the origins of softball go way back to Thanksgiving Day in 1887. A group of men were gathered in a yacht club in Chicago to listen to the results of the Yale versus Harvard football game. Once the final score was announced, a supporter of one team threw a boxing glove at a supporter from the other team. Pretty soon, someone had grabbed a broomstick to take swings at the boxing glove as it was thrown around. And all it took was a reporter in the room, a man by the name of George Hancock, to yell, "Play ball," and a new game was invented. Seriously, that's all it was. Over the next week, Hancock would write up a set of rules for this new game that was essentially started as an indoor version of how to play baseball. He designed the game with a larger diameter ball, because similar to that boxing glove, and a shorter bat. And those things stuck after all these years. Hancock would become known as the father of softball. After gaining a following of its own for a number of years, the game would be played both indoors and outdoors. But one of the first organized regular softball games to be played outdoors took place in 1895 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was formed by a group of firefighters. They were looking for a good way to keep the firemen occupied and alert between emergency calls. But space was somewhat limited, so they used a larger ball with closer underhand pitching and shorter distances between bases than baseball had. The game between firemen became a regular, popular event for local residents to come watch, and before long it had spread through the entire city. The game continued to grow through the early 20th century as a simpler version of baseball that could be played in tight quarters. It became known by a wide variety of names, just like baseball had been at the beginning of its origins. Names like playground baseball, kitten ball, pumpkin ball, or mush ball were popular for softball at that time. And much like baseball during its first few decades, the game of softball was played slightly differently depending on which city or part of the country you lived in. That's the way the game of softball was until 1926, when the American Softball Association was established again in Chicago to maintain consistent rules and equipment no matter where it was played. Walter Hakkinen of the YMCA, he was the first commissioner of the ASA, was the first to suggest the name softball, and it stuck. Pretty soon, the game would be turning from a playground game into a more organized game as more and more leagues started adopting the official standard rules. The first softball tournament was played at the Chicago World's Fair in 1933. It was during this same time period in the late 1930s that softball became more and more popular as a women's version of baseball. Women's softball leagues started popping up all over the place, and by 1939 the first tournament for women was played, called the Tournament of Roses. Two teams that are well known to fans from a league of their own, the Rockford Peaches and the Racine Bells, competed in that first tournament. And so now we know that those teams depicted in a league of their own actually started out as softball teams. It wasn't until 1943 season, when so many men and baseball players were overseas fighting in World War II, that Philip Wrigley, the owner of the Chicago Cubs, founded the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. They recruited the best softball players from around the country to play in the new league. This women's baseball league lasted from 1943 to 1954. But in the years spanning from the origins of softball to the 1950s, the game was played as both fast pitch and slow pitch softball. Fast pitch is the type of softball game that's watched by millions at the collegiate level these days, and will be the type of softball played in the new professional league that's been established. Slow pitch, on the other hand, is what us middle-aged former athletes play on the weekends in a beer league just to stay in some semblance of shape. But in the 1950s, the fast pitch and slow pitch games of softball began to diverge from one another. Slow pitch became played more and more by leisurely fans and achieved formal recognition by the ASA in 1953. I'm not going to touch on slow pitch much here because it's not really the subject of this video. But let's just say within a decade after 1953, slow pitch had actually surpassed fast pitch in popularity as the most common form of softball played across the United States population. But the fast pitch version did continue to grow during the 1950s and 1960s, and saw some of its most prominent players of all time, like pitchers Bertha Ticky and Joan Joyce, both of whom won over 750 games in their career. The game of fast-pitch softball would coast along for the next few decades, being recognized as an individual sport, but at the same time not really gaining much notoriety. The next big moment for softball happened, though, in 1972, when Title IX went before the Supreme Court. The court ruled that colleges and universities must provide equal access to education for both men and women, and could not discriminate on the basis of sex. The fallout from that ruling that impacted softball was that if sports scholarships were available to men, an equal amount of them must be available to women. Of course, before that, young women were not encouraged to play sports nearly as much as young men were. So there just weren't as many women's sports that had been supported by secondary education. As these new scholarships were suddenly not only available for athletes, but required to be handed out, new women's sports programs were developed across the country to encourage girls to take up basketball, soccer, and other sports. So how did the Little League handle this change? Rather than encouraging girls to join Little League baseball teams or creating girls-only leagues, they instead decided to promote softball specifically for girls. Girls had the choice, of course, of playing baseball in a slightly different version that was called softball, or risk being the only girl on their team of boys if they chose to pursue the traditional game of baseball. I'm not going to get into the reasons of why the organization did this, whether it was for the purpose of keeping the genders separate, keeping women out of professional traditional baseball, or promoting the game of softball itself. I'm not sure. But whatever the reasons, it had a huge impact on propelling softball onto the national stage, more than it had been. As a result of this differentiation between the two sports, social pressures obviously took over, like they usually do, and girls by and large were diverted away from baseball and into softball. The universities therefore started handing out scholarships to young women for softball rather than baseball. And that's when the sport truly evolved into the incredibly popular and fast-paced game that we recognize today. The game continued to gain in popularity through the 1970s and 1980s, and by 1996 the sport really landed on the national radar when it was first established as an Olympic sport in the Summer Games in Atlanta in 1996, and it would be a mainstay in the Olympics for the next 3 games until it was removed from the roster after the 2008 Olympics. During this period, the game of softball expanded again in popularity behind amateur organizations like collegiate-level softball, the World Cup and Pan Am Games, and the Olympic teams. Key players like Ginny Finch, Lisa Fernandez, Jessica Mendoza, and Kat Osterman helped bring the sport into the mainstream much more, fighting for its place as a sport of its own rather than just the women's version of baseball. And softball has only continued to grow after 2008 as it has expanded to more and more countries outside the US, and collegiate softball has grown in viewership throughout the 21st century. Behind players like Monica Abbott, softball continued to be played in World Cup competitions throughout the 2010s until it was re-established as an Olympic sport for the 2020 Olympics. Professional women's softball in the US has been through a lot of ups and downs over the past few decades. The first attempt at a league was when softball legend Joan Joyce teamed up with other famous athletes like tennis icon Billie Jean King and golf star Janie Blaylock to form the International Women's Professional Softball Association in 1976. But that league only lasted 4 seasons from 1976 to 1979. The next attempt was by Jane Cowles, a former softball player who founded the Women's Pro Fast Pitch, or WPF League, in 1997. That league operated between 4 to 6 teams until 2001, but then shut its doors after that season. The National Pro Fast Pitch League revived the league in 2004, and they even partnered with Major League Baseball at that time for support to develop the new league, an attempt by Major League Baseball to reach out to women and women's baseball softball players. The NPF operated at between 4 and 6 teams through most of their seasons, but several of those teams were either traveling teams or essentially international squads like the Aussie Spirit and the Canadian Wild. Eventually, the league folded in 2021 after 2 canceled seasons due to the pandemic. It was a fairly successful run, but ultimately didn't survive. But it's been the continued elevated play by young stars like Lexi Kilfoyle, Brie Ellis, Sam Landry, and Tiara Jennings that has brought the game of softball into the forefront this past week with Major League Baseball's announcement that they are partnering once again, this time with the Athletes Unlimited Softball League, to form a new professional league for 2025. Players like Carly Hoover are even returning to play in the league after having to play in Japanese professional league where she excelled the last number of years because there has been no professional league in the United States in the past 5 seasons. I can say that both my daughter and I are excited to catch our first game this summer. None of this is to say that women can't play baseball, though. Indeed, there are still millions of girls out there playing Little League, and we've seen the first women play in independent league baseball and collegiate level baseball as well. There could be a professional woman major leaguer that's been drafted and makes the major league someday too. But for all those women that chose softball as their path instead of baseball when they were young, now there will be opportunities to extend that path. I don't know about you, but there is much more to the story of softball than I ever imagined. Of course, the basis of the sport was formed from the game of baseball, but I never knew it was invented so long ago and has been its own association with its own rules for almost a century. Because of the shorter distance between the mound and the plate and between the bases, softball is on average actually a much faster game to play than baseball. There are stories of softball pitchers striking out Babe Ruth, Ted Williams, and Hank Aaron, just to name a few. And there have been numerous videos of more recent major league players, like Barry Bonds and Albert Pujols, for example, striking out as well against softball pitching. Even though they don't throw as hard underhand as Major League Baseball players do overhand, the reaction time has to be just as quick because the shorter distance from the pitching rubber to the plate means the softball is coming in just as fast, if not faster, than a 100-mile-per-hour fastball. And on top of that, you just don't hear of softball pitchers needing 1 or 2 Tommy John surgeries after delivering the ball underhand. Perhaps there's something to this game that's actually an improvement over the game of baseball that we love. So that's my story today, sharing with you the history of softball. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. As always, keep talking baseball or softball if that's your thing. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you around.